Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ganga Jamni's Facebook Live series. Today we have with us Chandrasekhar Tampi and Manav Kapur, who will be in discussion and they will be presenting a beautiful topic, which is about cinematic filmic depiction of 1947 partition in Bombay cinema. So let's welcome Manav and Chandrasekhar Tampi, who will take us through this journey. And good evening, guys.
Hi, good evening, Shagufta. Good evening, Manav.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Good evening, and I trust and hope that you're all safe and well. Today, in our talk, or rather, Manav Kapur's talk, we would discuss partition in the context of the cinema in the subcontinent, which is on either side of the border, not just Bombay. Uh, Partition, Vibhajan, or Taqsim-e-Hind, as we call it, was a cataclysmic event that visited us in the last century and had an impact on almost every sphere of life. And even today, we can feel the reverberations, whether it's political, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's how dissent is handled on either side of the border, whether it's the Indus Water Treaty. So, one thing that can surely be said about the partition or the solution that was seen about at that time was that it definitely has not gone down well, or it has not worked. But then I digress. So, like today, the film industry was impacted by a largely political move, and while Manav would describe it better and more, in my opinion, there were two broad things that happened. Firstly, the human aspect, in the sense that, like everybody else, there was displacement of people on either side of the border, in the sense that artists, actors, directors, musicians, lyricists, etc., were compelled to choose one or the other country. It was not so much a matter of choice as a compulsion. So we have Raj Kapoor, Dilip Kumar, Devanand, Sahir Ludhianvi, A.R. Kardar choosing India. We have Noor Jahan, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Manto, Sajjad Haider choosing Pakistan. Of course, Sajjad moves back to India, and over time. Interesting also is the case of Meena Shori, who actually goes to Pakistan somewhere in the mid 1950s, I think 1956 or 57, with her husband to shoot a movie. And then she stays back in Pakistan, and yes, 57, and then she stays back and she passes on sometime in the 1970s. Interestingly, Manto has this whole conundrum, this whole crisis has been described by Manto in a not a story, in an article where he talks about his interaction with Shyam, the actor who sort of almost became successful before he fell off the horse and broke his neck and died. So there is this story of his where he gradually sees a sort of hardening of emotions with Shyam, and he remembers that when Shyam drops him off at the ship, he walks down the causeway and he does not look back again. So that's essentially what the human aspect of partition is. The other part of partition that I think Manav would deal with is how partition is depicted in cinema, both in Pakistan and in India. Pakistan, that's Pakistan, erstwhile East Pakistan, and India over the decades. That is, the decades immediately following the partition till correct me if I'm wrong, till the 21st century.
We reached the 21st century eventually, I think.
I'm sorry?
I said we reached the 21st century eventually, I think.
So I think Mamo is probably one of the. I hope you're not dealing with Gadar.
No, I
Thank God.
I decided that Gadar is not something I'm going to watch again. So
I mean,
I had a broken hip. I watched Gadar when I had a broken hip, and I think that was the apogee of pain.
So you didn't have a choice, essentially. You were forced to. You couldn't run.
Yeah. I could definitely not run. I was just like on bed.
So I mean, of course. Manav will take you through how partition was depicted in in a few movies. Where there's hope, which vacillates between hope and distrust and despondence, and and a will to go on. So before I cede the floor to Manav, let me introduce Manav. Manav had just written to me as to what he thinks he is. So I'm going to read that out. Manav likes to call himself a lapsed lawyer, having studied and taught law at Nalsar and JGU. And he's now doing his PhD in history, and he's working in evacuee property and resettlement after partition. I think the first time I spoke to Manav was when I was discussing the internment of Japanese prisoners in Purana Killa. That's, I think, when we first touched base. And Manav, of course, his subject for his PhD is evacuee property and resettlement after partition. And he's also interested in poetry and Hindi film music. And therefore, he is uniquely placed to discuss the topic that we have today. So I happily cede the floor to Manav. And I am not going to come back for questions. I'm going to let Manav speak what he wants to and conveniently make himself scarce till the end of the talk. Thank you, Manav. And please, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Chandra. Thank you so much for this. So when I started thinking about this talk, I started thinking about how partition was depicted in a series of films from the late 1940s onwards, and so it's basically making a point both about the times in which these films were released, about how people understood these films, how they were made to understand these films, and how they lived through partition. But then I realized that when we were talking about this, we also kind of had to think about what was going on both in and outside the film industry when this was happening. And so as a result of this, this talk is is both about what these films are talking about, but also simultaneously about questions around politics and how these and what made these films possible at particular points of time. So I mean, this goes from the 40s onwards. I look at two Pakistani films, where one Pakistani film and one Indo-Pak collaboration, three films from the Bombay film industry that later became Bollywood, and one and Garam Hawa, which I think is so famous and so deservedly so that it deserves a special space in this discussion. So right, so if we were to actually start with so I wanted to start with a video clip, and this video clip is in this film called Lahore in 1949. So this is one of the first films that actually talks about partition. Yeah.
घूमी हैं हमने दिल्ली और इंदौर की गलियां, न भूली हैं न भूलेंगी हमें लाहौर की गलियां। ये लाहौर है, पंजाब का दिल, जिसके जिक्र पर आंखें चमक उठती हैं, दिल धड़क उठते हैं। लाहौर का ख्याल आते ही ये खूबसूरत तस्वीर आंखों के सामने नाचने लगती है। इस खूबसूरती का राज यहाँ की बुलंद इमारतें या पुरफजा बाग नहीं, बल्कि यहाँ के बासी थे। हमारी कहानी इस शहर के एक छोटे से घराने से ताल्लुक रखती है। ये एक सच्चा वाक़ा है, लेकिन नाम फर्जी है।
Hi. Yeah, so this is actually a particularly interesting clip because it comes in this film called Lahore in 1949, and but it's actually a pre-partition clip. So as you can see, you go to the Mall Road in Lahore, which is a colonial development. There is the railway station. What's interesting about the names on the Mall Road is we see is that the majority of them are Hindu, and that actually is what the is one of the things we're going to talk about when we talk about the film. But the interesting thing about the purpose of our talk and why I wanted to start with this is that not only is this a depiction of the city of Lahore, but in the 1940s, Lahore is also a major center of the Indian film industry. So in the 1940s, Hindustani cinema or Hindustani speaking cinema is split between Bombay and Lahore. Calcutta still has a small role to play, but that's kind of changing. And a lot of the talent of Bombay in the 1930s and 1940s comes from Punjab, usually via Lahore. So, as Chandra mentioned, singers like uh, Shamshad Begum and Zinat Begum, Zohrabai Ambalewali, and Surendra started their careers in Lahore. The reigning queen of the Bombay film industry at the time of partition, and she moves to Pakistan later, is Noor Jahan, who actually moves from Lahore to Bombay in 1943. But by this time, Lahore has had its apogee of filmmaking in the early 1940s. Two windfall hits have come up. One is Khazanchi. And can we go to slide 3, please? Yeah. So, right. So, like with slide 3, we see that. So, the first person on the left is Dalsukh Pancholi, who was the head of the Pancholi filmmaking, the Pancholi studio. He delivered a massive hit in 1941, India's highest-grossing film called Khazanchi. Khandan, which he also made the following year, was second. Khazanchi had this very famous song called "Sawan Ki Nazare Hai," which had these women in cycles. And if you talk about the Lahore film industry pre-partition, the first thing most people talk about is Khazanchi and this idea of modernity in Lahore. He later made a film called Zamindar in 1943, which is actually interesting because Zamindar has Shanta Apte. Shanta Apte is one of the actresses who is one of the most famous actresses of the 30s and 40s, again a singing star, who actually starts off in Bombay. So she's one of the few people to actually move from Bombay to Lahore. The bulk of migration until 1947 is usually from Lahore to Bombay. And in fact, Shanta Apte only makes this film and goes back to Lahore. Noor Jahan, who is the second person in this clip, in this uh, slide, is also one of the most famous singing stars of pre-partition India. She moves to Pakistan. She's called the Malika Tarannum, and there are questions about what Lata would have been doing had Noor Jahan not left. Now, the dislocations of partition therefore affected all aspects of national life, and the film industry was no exception to this. Now, at one level was the movement of what is now called human resources. So the two reigning singing stars of the Indian film industry, both Noor Jahan and Khurshid, crossed the border. Manto, who was the chronicler of the film industry and of partition, as we've seen in the film Manto, moves in early 1948. Directors like Mehboob and Qatar also crossed the border. But the other movement that's also happening simultaneously is that of capital. So if the Lahore industry gained in talent, it lost in economic clout. Most financiers and the largest film producers of Lahore made their way to India, eventually to Bombay. And because of laws around cinema, around evacuee property, cinema halls, studios, and godowns all kind of closed for a while. And Urdu filmmaking ceased for the next 2 or 3 years in Lahore. There were a few films made. There was one called Teri Yaad, but there weren't really too many of them. Now, this led to a strange kind of love-hate relationship between both industries. So both, at one level, both people continued to move. Chandra mentioned Meera Shore's name. Meera Shore is a very interesting character because she moves from Lahore to Bombay in 1947. She marries the evacuee owner of a major film studio in Lahore, called Shore Studios, relaunches her career in 1948 in India, and is known for her comedic timing. One of her most famous songs actually is also is the song called Lara Lappa Lai Rakhta, which is also a Punjabi lyric. And then eventually she moves back to Pakistan in 1957. The other really interesting thing that happens in this first decade is that there's also this major child star in India called Ratan Kumar. So Ratan Kumar was the hero of this amazing film called Jagriti, which most of us have heard of and heard the lyrics of. Uh, it has the song Sabarmati ke Santu ne kar diya kamal. Now Ratan Kumar makes this paean of praise to Nehru and Gandhi and then moves to Pakistan the next year and then makes the movie again in Pakistan with the Qaid-e-Azam. So Sabarmati ke Santu ne kar diya kamal becomes E Qaid-e-Azam tera ehsan hai ehsan. So, I mean, so this movement doesn't entirely stop with partition. Next slide, please. But what then happens is that there's also a major suspicion of anyone from the other dominion. So all these clips that we see over here are clips from this magazine called Film India, which is one of the most popular film magazines of India after partition and before, actually from the 30s to the 60s. Now, film actors, directors, and producers start to be seen as enemy agents. This is also largely because they are involved in the transfer of money across both borders, and both borders are emerging as economic frontiers very quickly. So, J.C. Anand, who made the first Pakistani film Theriyad in 1948, but was Hindu, and continued to live in Pakistan. In fact, he's also Juhi Chawla's grand uncle, had his property confiscated in Lahore in 1950. Mehboob and his brother-in-law both had their property taken over under Indian evacuee property laws. So this whole idea of of Pakistanis as or Muslims generally in India being largely Pakistani is something that comes through very strongly in the pages of Film India. That's also because of Baburao Patel's politics. So he largely refers to Muslims in India as fifth columnists. He says they have divided loyalties. He says that when he has to define a Pakistani, he says this is someone who's looking at Karachi as the Mecca of his dreams. And then of course, like all these tropes of the lascivious Muslim and all play out in these. So next slide, please. The other thing that Film India also does at this point is valorize refugee filmmakers. So there's this film called Raat Ki Rani that actually bombs at the box office in 1948, but is sold to people on the basis that it was one of those films from made by 5 refugees from the Punjab who have taken their own sighs and suffering into a song of smiles for the millions. Roop Rekha, which actually has nothing to do with Punjab apart from the fact that its director is Punjabi, uses the burning Punjab trope again for excitement and for sympathy. But the major problem that actually is happening in the late 1940s between India and Pakistan is about Kashmir. And Pakistan's first film actually is called Kashmir Hamara Hai. So the first feature film that they release is called Theriyad, but there's a propaganda film made a few months before that called Kashmir Hamara Hai. And but the other issue is that of abducted women and of property. So the two films that we're going to talk about from the late 1940s are both films that are actually that have this as central to the issues. So slide 5, please. Slide 6, please. Yeah. So this one is. So slide 5 is actually a clip from Aag, which is Raj Kapoor's debut film. So in this, this is one of the first things to mention partition, even though very transitorily. So Nargis over here is asked what her name is and is asked where she's from. And she says, I have no name, I have no home. So Raj Kapoor says, like, how can you not have a name? What is your name? And she says, and he says, where have you come from? Kahan se aayi hain? And she says, main Nark se aayi hu. So he is understandably flabbergasted. And he says, Nark. And then she says, agar Punjab Nark nahi hai, to aur kya hai? मेरे वालिदा इस नर्क में जल के राख हो गए, मेरे भाई बहन इस आग की लपटों में जल के राख हो गए, तो मेरा कोई नहीं है, मेरा नाम ही नहीं है. And so the film Lahore that we're going to talk about also has Nargis in it. Uh, Next slide, please. So we started off with a conversation with the depiction of Lahore at the beginning of this talk. But the interesting thing about the film is that the director of the film, the lead actor, are brothers, both from Lahore. Two out of the three actresses are from Lahore. Nargis is half Punjabi, even though she's from Bombay. And the film is starts off as a college romance story after this, after marking out, the geography of colonial Lahore. So Chaman and Lilo are two college students from two middle class families in Lahore before partition. They seem to have an understanding between each other, quote unquote. However, Chaman's father is convicted of embezzlement and dies. The engagement is at an end, and at this point of time, somewhat unexpectedly in the film, partition happens. So when they show partition, the way they show it is through montages of newspapers and fires, and all of a sudden the action shifts to the Amritsar railway station, where Chaman meets Lilo's mother in a refugee camp just behind it. So when Chaman meets Lilo's mother, she weepingly tells him that Lilo has been left behind in Lahore and that she has no idea about whether she's alive or dead. As Chaman sets out to find her, he meets another friend of his who was affianced to Shanti, who is played by Kuldeep Kaur in this. Shanti has been raped in Lahore and is now pregnant. His friend casts her out, saying in accepted Bollywood fashion that the paap ki gachri mein nahi sambhal sakta. And also then abducts a girl called Salma. Now, Chaman is horrified by this and then argues that Sakina has to be returned. Now, as it happens, in the film, Lilo is alive and is living in the same house that she lived in. Now, this house is occupied by a Muslim mother and son, and so has obviously been taken over as a vacant property. Disguised as a vegetable vendor, our hero Chaman makes contact with her and then persuades her to come with him to give her a new life despite her quote-unquote inner darkness. Now, so, it's interesting because the film tries to be progressive by the standards of the 1940s, but it's really not. So all these women in the film lack agency and need men to validate their claims of belonging. And the interesting thing is that this is very similar to the legislation around abducted women at the time. So the whole idea of abducted women being sent back to their homes and this question of what the home is something that is necessarily problematized by partition. Is something that comes through when you look at all the laws around abducted women as well. So all women who were abducted were seen as the property of the other dominion and had to be sent back, irrespective of what they actually wanted. Now this was and so it's interesting because even in the film, like the whole idea of sending Sakina back is subject to the idea of Lilo coming back. So
There seems to be an error on Manav's side. I believe he's rejoining us. Hi, Chandra.
Yeah, I think there's a data issue there at Manav's end.
Right.
Shagutha, what you can also do is you can click on slideshow and enlarge the slide. It can be done. Just click on slideshow and give it a full screen. Yep. Let me reduce it. I think we should just wait for Manav.
Okay, in the meantime, I think, Chandra, can you continue the story of Lahore if you've seen it?
Yeah, so the okay, let's wait for Manav for a minute. If he doesn't,
I hope it's not a power outage.
let me just, let me just call him.
Okay.
I'll just stop the camera.
Okay, in the meantime, I'm going to take up questions and join the session. Oh, thank you so much, Rituparna Sen Gupta, for saying that. Um, okay, I think that's a very pertinent question by Brinda Maheshwari. If you have time, would love to hear more about how such laws were enforced. I think we have Chandra here, who's a lawyer. So Chandra will be able to talk about that. So lucky here. Um, there is indeed a song everywhere. Okay. Chandrasekhar, if you can hear me, can you come back on the screen, please? Thank you.
Manav, I just spoke to Manav. Manav says he's been disconnected, so you probably have to log him back again.
I will. I have. But in the meantime, Chandra, can you please take up this question that one of our viewers, Brinda Maheshwari, is asking? If you have time, would love to hear more about how these evacuee laws, I think she means, were enforced.
Evacuate property laws.
Property laws, yes.
Yeah, so can we, because this question will come up again and again, so we take that towards the end of the conversation. I think Manav is just joining us. Is he?
I don't see him. Manav, you'll have to join us again. You'll have to log back in. Something's wrong on his end.
No, Manav says he's been disconnected.
No, no, no. I don't see him.
Can we just end the session and then start again?
Um, he'll have to re-log in.
Okay, let me go back.
So, in the meantime, for those of you who are still happily and loyally watching us, could you please tell us about your partition story? Is there a partition story in your family, or has there been any narrative that you've heard ever since you were, for instance, I have a story. My great grandfather was actually the station master at Lahore, and his family was at the time when the partition was announced, his family had moved towards eastern Punjab, and their life started for them. And for the longest time, my great grandmother, according to my grandmother, would call people on this side of the border Hindustani. So this is something very interesting because everyone in my family laughs about this at that. I mean, now, but I believe at that point in time, to to say that these people are Hindustani, years after years, was rather interesting. Let me add Manav back. I can see him. Hi, Manav. Can you hear us? Okay, something's wrong. We have very poor connection. Chandrasekhar, can you please join back in? Thank you. Chandra, can you narrate that story that you were talking about, the Sham and Manto story, please?
Okay, so there used to be this actor called Sham who was at some point of time struggling in Bollywood. He and Montu were uh, classmates in the sense that they would drink together. Manto at that time was, in addition to being a writer of serious short stories, also covering Bollywood. And Manto writes about Bollywood in first person accounts, of course, because he's a raconteur by nature, and that's how he writes about Shyam. So Shyam and Manto are very close friends. There is, when Partition is announced, Manto is reluctant to go, and Sham is, of course, also reluctant to let go of Manto, saying that things will work out. But eventually, as the story or the article pans out, Manto sees a slight hardening in Shyam's stance, and then he also midway through the article, starts referring to Muslims as them. So there is a line definitely drawn across the hearts of the people. At least there is a start to that. And this is from someone who, let's say, a couple of weeks or a month ago was very close to Mantu, and probably religion did not matter to him. But then that's what happened, and there's a hardening of attitude, and Manto sees it across the industry per se. And of course, he tries to depict this through the agency or through the means of Shyam. So finally, Manto decides to go to Pakistan, and when Manto is boarding the vessel, Shyam, of course, sees him back. And Manto, standing at the causeway, looks down, and Shyam doesn't. Oh, hi, Manav.
Hello.
And Shyam leaves after dropping Manto, and Shyam does not look back. So that's how Manto tries to depict the changing attitude in the film industry at that point in time. Over to you, Manav.
Okay.
We were on slide 8. We were still on Lahore, and the lack of, you were talking about the lack of agency as far as the three women, Sakina, Nimmo, and Shanti, were concerned. Shakila, Lilo, and Sakina, Lilo, and Shanti were concerned.
Yeah. So basically, sorry about that, guys. The internet, as usual, is my enemy, as is all technology. But so yes, that's so basically
just a minute, Manav. I just wanted to ask. I mean, it's very interesting that, of course, the Lahore industry in the 1920s was owed to a large extent, the film industry, to A.R. Kardar. And after partition, A.R. Kardar does choose to leave the industry there and stay back in India, right?
Sorry, I didn't get the last bit. Hello.
So A.R. Kardar moves to India eventually after partition.
Yeah, so Kardar has actually moved to India in 1944, and then he goes back to Lahore in 1948 because he thinks so. He makes Dard in India and then goes back, and then realizes that not really working out for him, and then comes back to India and is based there. His brother, on the other hand, A.J. Kardar, stays in Pakistan, and he actually makes this very interesting film called Jago Hua Savera that we'll talk about very briefly also.
And I think he's also related to the India-Pakistani cricketer A.H. Kardar. I think
so. He is A.H. Kardar's cousin.
Yes, cousin. So, I'm sorry, just carry on. Please.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry about the break anyway. So, right. So then, basically, so the interesting thing is that in this film, we really don't see that the women as such have any agency at all. It's all about the benevolent state and their protectors in the absence or the temporary absence of the state helping out. The much more nuanced story, though it kind of descends into twaddle at the end. So Apna Desh actually is a film by V. Shantaram. Can you go to slide 8, please? Hello? Okay. Right. So basically, Apna Desh was directed by V. Shantaram in 1948 and aroused great controversy. We'll talk about the controversy later. It begins with the celebration of independence, which shows economic flux. There's shortage, there are high prices, there's increasing rationing as big business and the film industry exults in the in excitement and saying that we're going to be able to make films on Gandhi and then Subhash Chandra Bose and get lots of money. Some of this is also, I mean, some of these high prices and increased rationing also because of partition. So partitioning India had drastically reduced food availability with the loss of East Bengal and West Punjab and Sindh. And 1949 is also when there's an economic trade war between cotton and jute and leads to gold. Like it seems like the situation is ripe for smuggling. And we have a smuggling story over here. So the video, please. Can we have the Apnadesh video? The Miss Kala Chashma video. The third one.
Hi, we're trying to upload the video. In the meantime, can you talk about this?
Okay, yeah. So basically, okay. So the smuggling story is really interesting because the lead character in the film is this woman called Pushpa Hans, who was a singer from Punjab in the 40s. Yeah, I think. As basically as so
Manu?
yeah. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Miss Kala Chashma, she dons okay, and directs smuggling operations of goods from Karachi. And Mohini, she is the she's the head of a college. Can we have the video? Um, okay. So now, so it's interesting because she manages to actually play both roles as like one as this kind of Sati Savitri caretaker in college, and at night she's Miss Kala Chashma. She boards trains in the manner of one fearless Nadia. She directs smuggling operations. She loots a government armory. Now, and all of this actually is arising out of her angst at what has happened to her at partition. So when she's finally caught, and she's caught because she confesses because her fiance, an inspector, is basically caught in this, and he's suspected of having something to do with this. So she basically confesses and says that this is all coming from the fact that like no country accepted me. I was from what is now Pakistan, but I was raped over there. When I came back to India, my family didn't accept me, and so I had no loyalty, and this is why I was driven to Gaddari. And like the whole, and it's interesting because when she's talking, she's also looking at it as a treasonous activity. Now, so this, I mean, so I think in this is the nuance it shows, and to an extent it shows the amount of agency she has. She's actually taking over her own life. She's subverting both states in a way, trying to get revenge for what has happened to her. Of course, because this is a Bollywood film, this has to end in her repentance, and the last scene in the film actually has her under the national flag with her fiance. even so, this was deeply controversial. I think it's because this was so controversial that the film is not better known than it should be. The idea that a woman would betray her country was anathema to film India. He was actually calling the film "Apna Trash" and said this is an insult to Indian womanhood, which would rather have committed compromise with their honor or their love for their country. But it's actually fascinating that they understanding about gender roles here. The how do I say, the ambivalence that the state had to its women while simultaneously trying to act as parents betrayer for the state. So this is basically about the industry. This actually has an interesting thing that starts. So let's go to the next slide, please. 11. So the 50s is an understudied period in India-Pakistan history. So it's interesting because there are a lot of things happening. So from the early 1950s, the Lahore film industry starts to kick in, and as the Lahore film industry, they are both in competition with the Lahore film industry, with the Bombay film industry over, and also trying to safeguard their own market. So by film of the Pakistani film industry, it is superiority of Bombay, and the idea of trying to discourage Indian competition is particularly important.
Looks like we have a tech issue at Manav's end. Chandra?
I think there's something wrong.
Chandrasekhar?
Yeah, I think there's something wrong with Manav's data there. I think he's joining us back again.
He's going to rejoin. All right. So what is this Jago Hua Savera about?
Oh, Jago Hua Savera is again a movie that was. I mean, it's of course it's translated into English as The Day Shall Dawn. It was a 1959 movie. It was made by AJ Kardar. We had talked about the Kardar family of a little while ago. Interestingly, it had Tripti Mitra, the famous Bengali stage actress, portraying the role of this lady called Mala in it, and it was I wouldn't say it was sorry. I mean, I shouldn't be saying it's an Indo-Pak movie. It's a Pak movie in the sense it's collaboration between East Pakistan and West Pakistan. East Pakistan, of course, later became Bangladesh. The movie was shot outside Dhaka, and it's based on the fisher folk in a village outside Dhaka. I can't immediately recall the name, and it was interestingly. It was a script. I think it was Manik Bandyopadhyay, if I'm not wrong, and it was Manik Bandyopadhyay's script on which it was based. And the lyrics were Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Manav is back on, so we can let him take the lead.
I don't know what's happening. This has never happened before.
That's all right.
Yeah. So so thanks for that, Chanda. Thanks for taking over at very, very short notice. And thanks for that talk about Jago Hua Savera. So yeah, so basically in the from 52 to 57, both India and Pakistan are like the Lahore film industry and the Bombay film industry are in competition with each other. Pakistan is trying its hardest to ban Indian films, but banning Indian films affects Pakistani cinemas. As you can see, there's a Times of India report from the 50s that says that faced closure because of this. And finally, in 1957, there's an agreement that says that basically India and Pakistan can import a specified number of films of each country over time. Now, Lollywood then decides to, or what is later called Lollywood, then tries to start undercutting Indian cinema, not only with Urdu films, because they don't make much of, I mean, two or three films are a hit. Intizar with Noor Jahan was a hit. Dupatta with Noor Jahan 1953 was a hit. But then they decide to move to the Punjabi film industry. Uh, and the Punjabi film industry, and I think Kartar Singh is actually one of the major films of that time. Next slide, please. So Kartar Singh also comes at a particular point of time in Indo-Pak relations, because India and Pakistan's relations are at their warmest since independence in the late 1950s, I think, till date. Migration had slowed down on both flanks of the border. The Kashmir issue was on the back burner, and an agreement on the Indus Water Treaties was imminent. In fact, in 1961, Ayub Khan actually says that there's also a possibility that the Kashmir issue would be settled in the next 2 or 3 years. So you can imagine like the height of excitement in Indo-Pak relations in the late.
That's also when probably Nehru visits Pakistan, right?
Yeah, so Nehru visited in 1960 actually in September 1960, and he met with cheering crowds in Karachi, which shout Hind Pakistani Dosti Zindabad and Hindustan Zindabad, which is not a cry that's heard in Karachi very often. So, anyways, all of this is happening, and at this point in the late 1950s, Kartar Singh is made. So Kartar Singh actually kind of tries. So it's both a function of this amity in relations and also an attempt to capture the Indian market. So it actually relies very much on this notion of a shared Punjabiyat or a shared culture. So it's set in Punjab in the late in the years just before partition. And unlike most Pakistani films of the time, Hindus and Sikhs are not the subject of the stereotypes that they've been. So there's a Hindu where there's a Muslim soldier and there's a Sikh lambadar, and that forms the core of the village, as it were. Violence, when it comes, and partition-related violence, when it comes, actually comes because of outside activity. So this is also a trope in these partition films, right? That the village was peaceful, we were all together, we all lived in amity, and then suddenly, like someone came from outside and bahar se fasad shuru hua. So the death of Kartar's brother in the film basically becomes the flashpoint for badmashes of all religions to actually attack opposing communities, and they show this in the film. There's this one film where there's this one part in the film where where the Sikh father actually shoots his own son because his son tries to attack a Muslim girl. And of course, the trope again in this is this idea of all girls in the village being, like the daughters of the village and treated as such. The other interesting thing in the film is that it also actually it doesn't have cross-border collaboration, but it uses Amrita Pritam's famous film on the partition called Aaj Aakha Ware Shano. That's Shagufta, can we play that clip? And it's also celebrated, but of course, because it is a Pakistani film, it looks back with nostalgia onto pre-partition Punjab, but is also celebratory of Pakistan. Now, the other, the interesting thing over here is that again, like the whole question of the daughter is linked to questions of getting women home. But the interesting thing is that when you're talking about getting women home, it's not location of the woman that has changed. It is the location of the home. So, for example, in Lahore, in Khamosh Pani, which we'll talk about later, in Pinjar, which also came up in the late 2000s, and in Kartar Singh, the women are actually where they've always been, but because their men have moved, and because by extension the nation has moved, and this is also, I mean, in law you would call it domicile in some sense. Uh, the whole idea of the home changes. Um, Anyway, now in India, one of the most interesting films that has actually been made on the partition also comes up at this point of time. It's the film Dharmaputra. Now, Dharmaputra is Yash Chopra. This is uh, before Yash Chopra's, Switzerland turn towards. Dharmaputra is actually an interesting film because it talks about the importance of Hindu-Muslim unity in India, but it does not try to undo the factum of partition. So, how does Dharmaputra actually do it? It basically starts off in 1925 by showing the closeness between two families, the Muslim Nawab Sahab and a Hindu doctor, to the extent that the Hindu family actually adopts the illegitimate child of the Nawab's daughter. Um, there's this whole question of, like, again now this is also like linked to the earlier discussion we've had about daughters of the village, right? So like the daughter is seen as something fundamentally pure, and even though she has erred in terms of having a relationship out of wedlock with somebody, the Hindu family takes on the odium. The film again opens in 1925 with at the end of the Khilafat movement. So you see people holding up banners in Hindi and Urdu saying Hindu Muslim Bhai Bhai Zindabad. Now, after the Nawab's daughter gets married, she moves abroad and returns back in 1947 to her house in Delhi to discover that the situation has changed very much. You see slogans of partition now being on the cards, and the country split between slogans of Nahi Batega Desh Mahan, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, and Qaid-e-Azam ka Ehlan Leke Rahenge Pakistan. Interestingly, her son Dilip, who is actually Shashi Kapoor in his first role, has grown up to be an extremist Hindu, and this is like to see how he's depicted as an extremist Hindu. He believes in the RSS. The RSS is mentioned by name. He is ascetic. He is trying and failing, let me point out, to be celibate, and is completely joyless. The message of the film is also interesting because the film, and can we, Shagufta, are we going to be able to see the clip?
Don't know why we're not able to play the clip.
Okay,
Try once again. If you try.
We're trying.
Okay, so basically, so it's interesting because there is a conversation that happens between Dilip and his adopted brothers and sisters, except he doesn't know that they're adopted. Where he says that if Muslims will not get any share of India, if they want their own country, they will have to leave. And the brothers say that no, it's more important. So this is the Congress view in late 1947 also, that it's more important to get independence. So what if there is partition, and even if there is partition, that does not mean that India is no longer a homeland for Muslims. India is and will continue to be a homeland for everybody who believes in the idea of India. For those who don't, they can take their land and go. But that doesn't mean that this will be a Hindu Rashtra, as opposed to Dilip, who actually insists both on the Akhandita of India and on saying that India will be a Hindu Rashtra. And I think that this is particularly significant because his brother turns on him and says that it is because of people like you that the call for Pakistan has been raised. The call for Pakistan has come about because of people like you who have treated Muslims as aliens, who have treated Muslims as achoots, who have treated Muslims like they have no role to play in India, who have like lived in this canard of saying that Muslims are not or not truly Indian. Eventually, of course, he goes to attack his mother, and this is when he discovers that his mother is his mother, and we see what's happening here. Can you guys hear this? Um,
Can you please make a commentary on this clipping?
Okay, yeah. So basically, in this clip, they're talking. This is when the family kind of gets together. There is Hindu-Muslim unity. Dilip tries to go out to tell his compatriots to stop attacking Muslim houses. They are enraged and they threaten to kill him. And he and this is when like the forces of the state comes. So like the police comes and prevents the riot happening and like separates everybody and the film ends with Sare Jahan Se Acha and Nehru's speech about how India is for all. So I mean, so it's interesting because over here the argument that is being made in the film is particularly nuanced. They're saying that India is for all, but they're also not saying that they oppose partition. So it's like what the Congress is advocating in the 1950s, that we accept the creation of Pakistan, but we don't use Pakistan as as an excuse to create a Hindu Rashtra. And this becomes particularly and this is controversial. So it's interesting because the film is extremely controversial on both sides of the border. It is controversial in India because it depicts Hindus not as victims in partition violence, but as active collaborators, without necessarily showing another side. So it doesn't show Muslims attacking Hindus and Hindus responding to that. It shows Hindus as aggressors. And it is also controversial in Pakistan and is banned in Pakistan because it provokes anti-Pakistan sentiment. So Pakistan finds it hard to to understand the idea of India not becoming a Hindu Rashtra. Indians and this leads to riots in Delhi, particularly in refugee cinemas in Delhi. So in places like Karol Bagh and Daryaganj. So these people find it hard to look at a situation where Hindus are depicted as aggressors and as people with a share of responsibility for the partition violence. Yash Chopra now is scared of, and so veers away from overt films on the partition until Veer Zara in 2004.
Yeah, he goes back to Chiffon and Pearls. He goes back to make movie on chiffons and pearls.
Yeah, I mean there's Waqt, which is also about
about the Quetta aspect before partition.
Yeah, but the whole idea of like two split, like a family split is like trying to create the idea, and he says this in the interview that he's also looking at both India and Pakistan as long lost brothers. But then he moves to chiffons and Switzerland, and so that basically tells you about the pitfalls of making partition related movies.
Or the risk-taking ability of Bollywood, anyway.
Yeah. Which is, except for Shantaram, is pretty low. So, so this, the clip isn't playing, but the photo that I have over here is the
I can try and play this clip. Let me just see if I can share it for you. Share screen.
Yeah, so this is actually the conversation between the siblings, where he's saying that if Muslims want to leave, they can leave, and his siblings are pushing back, and he says that that Muslims have always to convert Hindus at the sword, and his sibling says no, if that were true, they've ruled for hundreds of years, they would have converted everybody. This is all propaganda. This is right-wing propaganda, and then they call him the little dictator, which is a reference to the Charlie Chaplin film and to Hitler. So then Now,
Is
this
that
is
Deven Verma in the corner?
yeah, it's Deven Verma and Shashi Kapoor. So this is actually the high point of Indo-Pak amity also, as it turns out. Post 1965, the 65 war becomes a break between both countries. It means a ban on Indian and Pakistani films that lasts until 2004. And because of this ban, Lahore's film industry kind of freed from the constraints of Indian competition, enters its golden age. Um, the golden age then, by the 1970s, descends into Mola Jat territory, which basically involves like lots of men with lots of
Dasas and feudalism.
men. Exactly, the Gandasas and feudalism, and Noor Jahan singing increasingly sleazier and sleazier songs, um, which we can talk about at some point. Um, but so the last Pakistani film actually to be released in India is released in July 1965. It's an East Pakistani production, and it's called Aakhri Station, as it happens. So now the next, but after, can we go to the next slide, please? The Garam Hawa slide. Um, Now, Garam Hawa actually is interesting because it now moves from looking at, like, so we see that the trajectory moving from abducted women to the idea of, like the nation's majority community as aggressors, to actually looking at what making minorities actually entailed. So, like how feasible was staying back? How was staying back an option? For whom was it an option? How were people kind of forced out of their uh, of their homelands, even after the cataclysmic violence of 1947? Um, and this story is actually the story that is more common through the subcontinent apart from Punjab. So this is the story of how Hindus moved from East Bengal to West Bengal, how Muslims moved from UP and Bihar to Pakistan throughout the late 40s and early 50s. And now what happens actually is that, you talk, and this film actually shows us all of this happening. It shows how legislations like the Evacuee Property Act uh, link up to discrimination in loans and employment opportunities to minorities on both sides of the border. This is particularly significant if people have Muslim League affiliations. And so, like, Baldad Sani plays a shoe manufacturer in Agra who actually wants to live in Agra and does not want to go back. His brother, on the other hand, is a Muslim League politician. He moves to Pakistan. His brother's movement to Pakistan becomes a way by which the government takes over his Haveli and allots it to a Sindhi. He stops getting loans from the bank, and it's interesting because he goes to the Punjab National Bank of all banks, which is also a bank that at this point of time has early 1948. So he moves from Lahore to Delhi. And the PNB actually, and the PNB loan officer actually says, we can't give you a loan because we don't know whether you'll go to Pakistan or not. So Salim Mirza, Baldad Sani's character says, but जो नहीं गए हैं और जिनको जाने का भी कोई इरादा नहीं है, उनको क्यों सजा मिले? And the loan officer very clearly says, well, जैसे लोग गए हैं, हमें पता नहीं था वो जा पाएंगे. And so then they lose their house, they move into a new house. Next slide, please. The next slide. So the new house is much more cramped. It has these jalis, which kind of shows this constant sense of constriction and of limits placed on one's view, but also in a sense shows the relative position of the Muslim in post independence India. So Dharmaputra is of course very ends on a happy note, but it takes until Garam Hawa, 25 years after partition, for someone to actually talk about the costs of partition and those who bore those costs. His daughter, again, there's a link with gender here because his daughter has two fiancés. One of them is forced to go to Pakistan because he's come without a permit to India. The other has moved to Pakistan and has married somebody over there because he also needs to figure out a way to live. And well, ultimately she commits suicide. After she commits suicide, they decide to leave. And the end is very significant and very poignant because two different things happen. So the first thing that happens is that on the way to the station, when they decide to leave, they see a leftist protest happening for jobs. Salim Mirza's son jumps off the tanga and joins the protests and says, "I won't leave." His father also, you know, eventually follows suit and tells the tanga wala to go back with his wife. And at the end of it, it says, "Koi kab tak akela reh sakta hai." Now, the interesting thing over here is, and this is not something that's been talked about, but I've been thinking about this after having watched the movie multiple times, is that the one person who is actually Akela at the end of the film is the mother. The mother has lost her mother-in-law who has died after they've left the ancestral Haveli. She has lost her daughter. Her sisters-in-law have all moved to Pakistan. And so basically, like the question is that, for them, of course, as men, it is one thing to say, like we will fight it out over here. But what happens to women when they want to go back? Now, to get an answer for this question, you actually have to go to a later film, again, that comes 20 years later, called Mammo, which is by Sham Benegal. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the Mammo clip is invisible, but basically Mammo is...
Play the Mammo clip. I'll play the Mammo clip if you want. I'll play the Mammo
Okay.
clip. Just going to play it for you.
Okay, no, then let's do that in 2 minutes. I'll give the background of the story. So what happened with Mammo is that Mammo's actual name is Mahmooda Begum. She was born in Panipat. She moves to Pakistan with her husband in the early 1950s, according to the film. Her sister and two of her sisters and her grandson live in India. Now, one sister marries someone who's rather unscrupulous, who disposes of the Panipat Haveli and doesn't give them the money. The other sister is eking out a frugal existence in a small house in Bombay. Mammo comes and visits, stays over there, keeps going to the police station and having her visa extended until a point where she bribes the police to say that she has a permanent visa when she doesn't. Now, this is also interesting because this is, again, in the 1970s. It's talking about how difficult it is for live in India, even if they want to, even if they have family here, even if they don't have family in Pakistan. And her ambivalent legal status is a source of trouble. And on the day before each, she's deported to Pakistan on the frontier mail. Again, like the whole question of ghar keeps coming up here as well. So the police woman who actually escorts her to the police station speaks hit Bambaiya and says, "Ghar hi to jata hai, kahe ko itna चिक चिक करता है, काहे को इतना रोता है?" And she says कि नहीं, ये मेरा घर है, ये देश मेरा घर है, या ये इस वतन में मेरी मिट्टी है, मुझे वहां पे क्यों भेज दे? Now, 20 years later, she returns to Bombay, and then she announces a scheme of circumventing this situation. And again, this is about the costs that partition imposes on its victims. Can you play the clip, Chanda?
Yeah, I'll just do that.
Yeah. This is it's actually chilling. It like has chills running down your spine. And yeah, Rohan is right. This is right. This is in a way equal to.
मैं वापस नहीं जाऊंगी। इस दफे कोई माई का लाल महमूदा बेगम को हथकड़ी लगाकर सरहद पार नहीं कराएगा। नहीं।
नाम महमूदा बेगम अहमद अली, शौहर का नाम महरूम अहमद अली मसूद, उम्र 75 साल, रिहाइश लाहौर पाकिस्तान, इंतकाल 25 मई 1994। कॉपी टू पाकिस्तान हाई कमीशन न्यू दिल्ली, Copy to immigration officer, Bombay Police.
अब मैं चिराग का जिन बन गई। जिसके पास चिराग होगा वही मुझे देख पाएगा।
Right. So, I mean, this is very interesting because it kind of, like when you watch it in 2020, it makes you think about so many different things. It's the whole question is that she can only come back to India in a sense by being legally dead.
Dead.
So, and this is all a function of a paper bureaucracy that is, so like the whole idea of like kagas nahi dikhayenge actually doesn't work here. She is using her kagas actually to prove her death, and in doing so to live in India for an indefinite amount of time.
And if you go back to Garam Hawa,
Yeah.
the whole point of integration of a Muslim into the Indian mainstream is by him joining a protest against the government and not being considered anti-national. Because towards the end, Farooq Sheikh. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that the whole process of integration of a Muslim into the Indian mainstream is complete when you see Farooq Sheikh joining a protest against the government of the day.
Yeah. So I mean, like there's but that's a leftist protest against the government. And
yeah,
and
of
that,
course. I mean, he's not castigated for his religion because he joins the protest. Is the whole point that I'm trying to make here.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting way in which that that comes through. That the whole idea of him, his Indianness is cemented in his protesting against Nehru's government.
Exactly.
Right. So I mean, so like from Mammo, I think it's kind of inexorable that we move to the next and the last film of this discussion, which is Khamosh Pani.
Khamosh Pani.
So Khamosh Pani actually is, I mean, here the death is more than legal. This film is, again, interestingly, it's a collaborative exercise. The director is Pakistani. The screenplay is written by an Indian Punjabi filmmaker whose family is originally from Lahore. Two of the stars are Indian, Kiran Kher in her better days, and Shilpa Shukla. Khamosh Pani actually looks at the question of staying back in the context of religion, of religious conversion. So how did people make peace with staying back and with religious conversion? Now, this is a significant step from the 1940s. So in the 1940s, when, again, to quote from Film India, there was a point where Babu Rao Patel was asked, what do you think about the idea of conversion? And he says that conversion for a Hindu is equivalent to the consumption of potassium cyanide. For a Hindu or Sikh, actually, he says, is equivalent to offering him potassium cyanide. Similarly, depicting conversion on screen in a positive way was also box office poison. As Urvashi Butalia, so now by the late 1990s, you've had Urvashi Butalia's work come out. You talked about, how partition affected women specifically, questions of how questions of honor were deeply imbricated on the bodies of women. It was preferable for women to die. And in this film, you'll see that fathers actually tried to kill their daughters rather than to subject them to the threat of dishonor. You also have Urvashi Butalia's work talking about her uncle converting and staying back. And so, and what it says is that conversion also offers you a liminal, ambivalent relationship. Your membership in the body politic of the state is always ambivalent. In Khamosh Pani, how being a woman makes it doubly so. Now, the film is set in Pakistan in 1979. It depicts the impact of Zia's Islamicization and is then about the ghosts of partition. So the film starts off with Kiran Kher being shown as this person called Aisha. She's a middle-aged widow. She lives in a village in northern Pakistani Punjab called Charkhi, which is next to the Panja Sahib Gurdwara, and teaches the Quran to young children. She has a son, Salim, who is in love with a girl who's studying in school. The girl's a better student than him. And Aisha's life is unexceptional except for one thing: she never goes to the village well. And even though she never goes to the village well, and she's known as such, so in the film, like she's referred to when people are trying to identify her as "Oh, jedi khute nahi janti hai," she who doesn't go to the well, is but she's well loved in the village. She has her friends, she has her son, she is a recognizable person in her village setting, and and like the setting is also of a very typical Punjabi village. Again, there's a Punjabiyat on both sides, like the both sides of the border. Punjabiyat continuing in Pakistan, like weddings are performed the same way. The same revolt songs are sung at weddings and stuff like that. Aisha unfortunately has the misfortune of living in what are interesting times in Pakistan. Zia's Pakistan is Zia's age has started. This film is based in 1978. There's also one of the first situations where politics interferes with the film is where the village postman tells Aisha that the prime minister has been hanged. So again, the film's in Punjabi. It says Wazir Azam phaila deta hai. And Charkhi is no exception to this. Things become more complicated because of Charkhi's location as next to the Panja Sahib Gurdwara. Because 1977 is also again one of the years of normalization of Indo-Pak relations. One aspect of this normalization means that Sikh pilgrims start coming to Pakistan again after 1965. Now, for the older generation, of course, this is a sight for welcome eyes. For the younger generation, including Aisha's own son, who is now getting increasingly radicalized, again, by people from the city, these Sikhs represent an alien population. Their long hair, their strange customs, their strange prayers, only capable of arousing derision or anger. In the course of this, one of the Yatris who has come starts making inquiries about his sister. The interesting thing is that the town has grown, so he's unable to figure out where he used to live as a child. But the moment he figures out where he used to live, he goes there, knocks at the door. Aisha opens the door. He calls out to her. He says, "Are you Viro?" She says, "I don't know who Viro is." He shows her the picture. It is her. At this point of time, by ill luck, Salim comes. Salim is horrified. Now, interestingly, the contrast with Dharmaputra is clear. In Dharmaputra, when he realizes that his mother is actually Muslim, the son Shashi Kapoor is converted into Nehruvian secularism. This is a less idyllic film. Things don't really happen like that. She starts getting shunned by her son. She starts getting shunned by the rest of the village. Questions about her loyalty, questions about who she is keep coming. And the cruelest articulation of that is where the woman who always used to go to the well to get her water refuses to go. She goes to the well and she finds her brother there. Can we play that clip? Chanda, is that clip there?
मैं नहीं
बाबूजी घरों ਨੂੰ ਅੱਗ ਲਾ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਛੇਤੀ ਕਰੋ ਵੀਰੋ 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 ਵੀਰੋ
हीरो
Yeah. So in this, so at the end of this clip, she basically tells her brother that she is no longer Sikh, that she has no desire to go back. Her father, after all, wanted to, for whatever reasons and for laudatory reasons, have her killed. So she sees no point in going and seeing her father again, because she's like, there's no point. He wanted me to be dead. How would he, on his deathbed, react to the fact that I am both alive and Muslim? Her, so so he leaves, but by this time the village has turned against her. And finally, when she realizes that her son does not, her son has actually moved further to the right and is now moving to Rawalpindi, refuses to have anything to do with his mother. She at the end has no choice but to, in a chilling scene at the end, jump into the water again, and this time she dies. And the end basically shows the son as a cleric talking about the importance of Islam in Pakistan on TV
in the
as
present
his
day,
in 2003, yeah, in contemporary time,
2002, yeah.
yeah, as his girlfriend, as his ex-girlfriend goes to work, and says, I often miss Aisha Chachi, but then I think to myself, what what difference does it make to think about her? It doesn't even change the price of onions, which is a Punjabi term, a Punjabi expression of complete derision. So yeah, so basically, like in the course of this conversation, and there are many films I've left out. I've left out The Execrable Gadar. I've left out Pinjar, which also has a somewhat similar story. I have left out, recent films around partition, like Bharat and the not very good Viceroy's House, which looks at partition as a great game conspiracy. But I mean, like, so what?
Perfectly okay.
Yeah.
Which is perfectly okay.
Well, which is perfectly okay, but it doesn't. I mean, so what I'm trying to do in the course of this conversation is think about what partition has actually, what films around partition have made clear about both processes leading up to partition and about how people have reacted to partition, and about how that enhances or deepens or in other ways, enriches our understanding of this long and complicated process that, disentangling both India and Pakistan has been. So, like 1947 wasn't really an end in terms of like both countries going their separate ways. It was the beginning of a long, complicated, not quite twin relationship that India and Pakistan have had. And I think these films kind of bring out both the high points and the low points of this relationship. The one thing I actually wanted to point out, and I forgot, sorry, is in Khamosh Pani is that the second last scene actually has Salim, the son, opening his mother's trunk to find her copy of the Quran, um, a copy of the Sukhmani Sahib in Gurmukhi, and a Punjabi book, was a story book, I think, for children called Mera Khilona. And he opens it, he looks at it, and then he kind of immerses it in the river. And that immersion, I think, is his way of turning away from this old syncretic Punjabi that was valorized in at the beginning of this film and in uh, Kartar Singh, and moving towards his understanding of what a denizen of Zia's Pakistan needs to be. So that's basically the talk. I'm sorry, like, about the connection issues and stuff, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it. And I'm looking forward to questions if there are any.
Thank you, Manav. And I think it is towards the end, it got really intense. I can't believe that we've managed this and to have this beautiful discussion despite the tech glitches. And I want to thank Chandra. Chandra, thank you very much for being here. And Manav, thanks again. And what a wonderful topic you're working on. And all the very best for your PhD.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing. It's one of the few things that have given me any pleasure in the lockdown, actually.
Well, we're happy to be a part of that. And
Thank you.
thank you both for joining us. And all right, so for those of you, okay, Swati Das Gupta says great talk, and we should give a shout out to Swati Das Gupta because she introduced us to Manav. And
And
all
me
right,
to
thank
French.
you. Sorry.
So, and me to French in school. So
Yes.
yeah.
Oh,
So thank you so much.
okay.
This was
Thank
amazing.
you, guys. Thank you. Have a great evening and a fabulous. Okay,
I think Rituparna,
this
yeah,
one
the
is a question
questions.
on your way. This is a question by Rituparna Singh Gupta. Do you think adaptations of partition-based novels into films bring in something new or different to the cinematic representation on the subject? Say Ice Candy Man, Tamas, and Pinjar. Or and any comments on Bengali cinema similarities or differences with its northern western counterparts when it comes to the depiction of partition. I think we were going to have another talk on the East, sort of Pakistan and
Yeah.
yes, and Bangladesh, sort of quote unquote Bengali cinema. Uh, would you like
So
to take this up?
yeah, this is thanks Rituparna for this question. It's I mean the second part of it is something I wanted to bring up, but I think with both with time constraints and with tech glitches, it kind of slipped my mind. The yeah, so the answering the first part first, I feel like uh, novels around partition have more depth than films that have been made only on the partition. I like, I mean, things that have only been films. And so I feel like there is much more nuance to those stories, whether it's Dharmaputra, whether it's The Ice Candy Man, whether it's even in cases of Pinjar and Thomas, because I feel like they are able to capture nuance better than typical Bollywood. There are, however, exceptions. Gadar was originally a novel, a true incident that became a novel that became a film, Shahid Mohammed Bhutta Singh, and then became Gadar, which is a regrettable exception to this norm. So with regard to Bengali cinema, actually, the interesting thing is that I haven't watched too much on the partition, but the few films I have watched seem to suggest that the violence is, of course, very different from what is experienced in Punjab. So usually in Bengal, it's more like the Garam Hawa story. And there's a film by Tanveer Mukammal about Hindus moving into West Bengal from East Pakistan in the late 60s called Chitra Nodir Pare that has that story. Um, and so I feel like a lot of the films actually on the Bengali experience around partition haven't been about the displacement per se as much as it has been about the complicated process of rehabilitation and like getting your roots back. So like Chinnamul has a bit of stuff on like so it starts off in East Pakistan then moves west. A lot of Ghatuk's films actually are about people who are already in the West and dealing with partition. Ray, as I was talking to Chanda about this, and I don't think Ray actually touches on,
Mahanagar.
except for in Mahanagar, where there's this one scene again where the boss meets the husband of Madhavi Mukherjee and says, where are you from? And he says, I'm from Mabna, and he says, I'm from Rajshahi. But that actually explains the working woman in that film. So like and that actually is something I was thinking about even in the context of this discussion. So when we were talking on Meena Shode, for instance, Meena Shode's films, Ek Thi Ladki, and a lot of her other films actually have her as this kind of they're all screwball comedies which have her employed in office. So she's either a secretary or a typist or a typist that becomes a secretary. This is a promotion of great significance in her life in films. But again, like so what I was thinking was is that the idea of the working woman post partition in films is actually from the from like the earlier depictions of these westernized typist girls or Indira BAs or Madhuri BAs. These are women who are what in Bangla would be called Bhadru Mahilas, who are actually driven to employment as a result of partition and
Like Madhavi Mukherjee in Mahanagar.
yeah. So Madhavi Mukherjee is a perfect example of it. Um, yeah. So that's Any other questions?
Uh, then there is Rohan Nautiyal who says, thanks guys, it was a lovely talk. Swati Das Gupta, great talk. Rohan Nautiyal saying Mammo is a kind of prequel to Zubeda. Actually, it's not a prequel. It's a set of three written by Khalid Muhammad, Zubeda, Sardari Begum, and Mammu. They're not prequels per se. I mean, they're not prequels in the sense. They're more of a trilogy of unrelated. I mean, the only commonality is the Muslim protagonists.
Sure.
They're not prequels or sequels.
Links to his life, like fictionalized links to his life, I think, in some way.
Yes. Would you please play the clip of Aaj Akha Varis Shanu? Rohan, I'm going to send this to you. Please share computer audio. Yes, that's my mistake. Mea culpa.
All right. Okay, thank you so much. Love this session. Thank you, Mehak Kapoor, for being here and watching. And do more. For sure, we will be inviting Manav Kapur for another session.
Thank
And
you.
we should congratulate him for picking such a wonderful topic for his PhD and much needed and very beautiful, touching subject. I think it touches us on so many levels. Thank you both for joining us and have a very good weekend.
Thank you so much, Gupta, and thank you so much, both of you, for. Thank you, Chandra, especially for like sending me the clips and the pictures at a very short notice.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, Chandra is the savior for so many of us. All right, thank you. Great
Thank you.
evening,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.